Dear listeners, this channel publishes only full and exclusive audio stories. Please subscribe and like them if you enjoy them.
The Archive of Forgotten Women. Chapter 1. The Locked Cabinet. The rain had been falling on Verholt since before Wren Ashcombe's train crossed the last bridge into town, and it did not seem inclined to stop for her arrival. She stood beneath the narrow stone archway of the Verholt Municipal Archive with her collar turned up and her suitcase handle biting into her palm, and she looked up at the building the way she had once looked up at things she loved before she'd learned not to trust that feeling. It was a beautiful ruin of a building. 3 stories of pale limestone gone the color of weak tea, tall arched windows fogged with 40 years of neglected glass, a roofline of slate tiles that had slipped and cracked and never been replaced. Ivy had taken one whole corner of the facade and was working, patiently, on the rest. Somewhere above the door, half obscured by a rust stain shaped like a continent, the archive's old motto had been carved into the stone: "What is written is not forgotten." Someone, Wren thought, should have told that to whoever let this place fall apart. She had taken the contract on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the museum in the capital had quietly declined to renew her position, in the particular bloodless language institutions use when they mean "we would rather you disappeared without incident." The Verholt job had come through an old professor of hers, apologetic even as he offered it. 6 weeks. Cataloging. A condemned building about to be sold to a property developer who wanted the records gone before the sale closed, so that no inconvenient heritage designation could slow things down. It was not the kind of work that rebuilt a career. It was the kind of work you took when you needed somewhere quiet to not think about the career you'd lost. Wren pushed open the heavy door and stepped into a hall that smelled of stone dust, old paper, and the particular mineral coldness of a building that had stopped being heated years ago. "You're the historian." The voice came from a woman descending the main staircase with the unhurried authority of someone who had never once in her life needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. She was perhaps 60, silver-haired, dressed with a precision that made Wren instantly conscious of her own damp coat. Adeline Corvin. "I chair the closing committee." Wren Ashcombe. "Yes." Adeline said it as though she had already known, which perhaps she had. "I hope your journey wasn't unpleasant. The weather here has opinions." A brief, practiced smile. "I'll show you where you'll be working. I should tell you now, there isn't a great deal of time. The sale closes in 6 weeks, and the buyer has been patient, but not infinitely so. I understood it was mostly parish records. Land deeds. Mostly." Adeline turned and began walking, and Wren followed, her footsteps loud on floors that had not felt regular use in a long time. "There's also the East Wing, which you needn't concern yourself with. It was condemned after a roof collapse in 1978. Structurally unsound. We keep it locked for insurance reasons more than anything historical." "What's in it?" "Old medical records, mostly. A defunct sanatorium's files, transferred here decades ago and never properly processed. Nothing that concerns your inventory." Adeline said this the way a person says a thing they have said many times before, smooth from repetition. "Your task is the West Wing and the reading room. I'll have Pete show you the card catalog system, such as it is. It's not been touched in years, but you'll find the previous archivists were thorough, if slow." They passed beneath a row of dead chandeliers and into a long reading room, its wooden tables scarred with decades of use, its tall windows streaked with rain that turned the gray afternoon light into something soft and underwater. It was, Wren thought, despite everything, a beautiful room. The kind of room she had spent her whole professional life trying to earn the right to sit in. "It's lovely," she said, and meant it. Something moved behind Adeline Corvin's composed face. Not quite a softening, but an acknowledgement, briefly, that she had heard something true. It was, once. She did not finish the thought. "Pete will find you in the morning. Settle in. There's a hotel 2 streets from here, the Ostend, small, but clean, and the owner won't ask questions about your hours." A pause, precisely timed. People here are used to the archive keeping its own strange schedule. She left before Wren could ask what that meant. Pete Okonkwo-Vance turned out to be younger than Wren expected, perhaps 29, with the slightly apologetic posture of a man who had spent a career being underestimated and had made a kind of peace with it. He arrived the next morning with 2 paper cups of coffee, one of which he handed to Wren without being asked, and a set of brass keys that jangled like something out of an old novel. "You'll want gloves for anything before 1950, he said, by way of introduction. "The paper's acidic. It'll come apart if you breathe on it wrong." He looked at her properly for the first time. "Sorry. That's usually the first thing I say to everyone." "Pete." "Wren." "I know. Adeline told me." He said the name the way a man says the name of someone he has decided, quietly and permanently, not to fully trust. "She wants the West Wing catalogued room by room. Parish records first, since the buyer's lawyers keep asking about land boundaries. Everything else is." He made a small gesture that took in the whole neglected building, everything else, eventually. "If there's time." "And the East Wing?" Something flickered behind his eyes, there and gone. "Off limits. Structural." He said it too quickly, in the exact cadence Adeline had used the day before, as though the two of them had rehearsed it separately and arrived, by instinct, at the same careful sentence. Wren had spent 8 years learning to notice when 2 people gave her the same answer in the same tone. It was, more often than not, the sound of a story someone had decided on in advance. The first week passed the way archival work always did, in long, careful hours of dust and small discoveries, land deeds and baptismal records and the marginal notes of clerks 3 centuries dead. Wren did not think about the East Wing, or told herself she didn't, though she found her eyes drawn more than once to the tall double doors at the end of the West Corridor, sealed with a chain and a padlock gone orange with rust, and a small brass plaque that read "Condemned, do not enter," screwed on, she noticed, considerably more recently than the doors themselves. It was on the 9th day, in the late gray hour before the light failed entirely, that she found the gap. She had been cataloging a run of parish marriage records from the 1840s, shelved in a storage room that shared a wall with the sealed wing, when she noticed that the wall itself was not, in fact, a wall. It was a bricked partition, added later and clumsily, over what had clearly once been a doorway, the arch of it still visible in the plaster above, a ghost of a threshold someone had tried, imperfectly, to erase. Behind a stack of misfiled parish boxes, low near the floor where a hurried mason had run out of either bricks or patience, there was a gap perhaps 18 inches wide. Wren stood looking at it for a long moment. Rain ticked against the high window behind her. Somewhere in the building a pipe knocked, the sound of old iron cooling. She told herself, later, that she had only meant to look. The gap led into a narrow stone passage, black with dust, that ran perhaps 10 feet before opening. Not collapsed, not unsound, but simply forgotten, into what must once have been a records office. A single high window, its glass long gone opaque with grime, let in just enough gray light to show her the shapes of the room, a desk, a row of filing cabinets rusted shut, a wooden chair fallen on its side as though someone had left in a hurry decades ago and never come back to right it. And in the far corner, half hidden beneath a canvas dust sheet gone stiff with age, an iron cabinet. It was not large, perhaps 4 feet high, with a single narrow door secured by a padlock far heavier and far newer looking than the corroded chain on the entrance she'd come through. Someone had maintained this lock long after the room around it had been abandoned to rot. There was no shelf number on it. No accession tag. No mark of any kind to say it belonged to any collection, any inventory, any record that had ever, in 40 years, been officially acknowledged to exist. Wren's pulse did something complicated. She should have gone back through the gap, found Pete, reported it properly, filled out the appropriate forms for structurally unsound areas containing unlisted material. She knew this with the calm, procedural part of her mind that had built an entire career on doing things correctly. Instead, she knelt in the dust in her good coat and examined the padlock, and found. Because whoever had last closed it had either been careless, or perhaps, she would come to think much later, had wanted someone eventually to find their way in, that the hasp was not fully seated. A firm twist, and it came apart in her hands with a small, tired shriek of metal. The cabinet door swung open on a single hinge. Inside, stacked with a neatness that suggested they had been placed there deliberately, by someone who cared, were journals. Dozens of them? She counted, in that first stunned moment, at least 30, though she would not get the exact number until much later. Small, cloth-bound books, their covers dyed the deep brown-black of age, tied in some cases with ribbon, in others simply stacked. A faint smell rose from them, of dust and something else beneath it, something like the smell of the sea, salt and old paper. She lifted the topmost journal with the reverence she had once felt, before everything, for every fragile thing entrusted briefly to her hands. The cover bore no name. She opened it carefully, by the spine, the way her training told her to, and found page after page of handwriting, small, cramped, urgent, in a script she did not recognize as any language she knew. Not French. Not Dutch. Not German, though it borrowed something from the shape of German letters. She turned 3 pages, 4, looking for a signature, a date, anything that would orient her, and found instead that the strange script repeated certain shapes with a regularity that no natural language possessed. Symbols recurring in pairs. Numbers embedded where words should be. A cipher. Wren had spent enough of her career among the private papers of the dead to recognize the particular texture of a document written by someone who did not want to be understood by the people around her, but who very much wanted, someday, to be understood by someone. She turned to the final written page, near the back of the journal, where the hand grew visibly less careful, as though written in haste or in the dark. And there, unmistakably, breaking from the cipher into plain, unguarded script. As though the writer had, for one moment, stopped caring who might read it, or had simply run out of the strength to disguise it, was a single line. They will say I died of the lungs. I did not asterisk. Wren read it twice. Then a third time, aloud, very quietly, into the cold and dust and grey failing light of a room that had not had a living visitor in longer than she had been alive. Outside, the rain against the high window did not slow. Somewhere down the black stone passage behind her, she heard, or thought she heard, and would spend a long time afterward telling herself she had imagined, the soft, deliberate creak of a floorboard in a corridor where nobody else should have any reason to be standing. She turned, journal still open in her hands, and the light from the high window chose that exact moment to fail entirely, plunging the forgotten room into a darkness so complete that for one unsteady second, Wren Ashcombe could not have said, with any certainty at all, whether she was alone. Chapter 2. A Name in Code. The lights had not, in fact, failed on their own. Wren would learn this within the hour, standing sheepishly in the reading room while Peter Conquovance apologized for the third time for the building's ancient fuse box, which tripped, he explained, whenever more than one heater ran on the same circuit, and which he'd meant to warn her about on her very first day and had simply forgotten. You could have called out, he said, not quite meeting her eyes as he reset the breaker with the ease of a man who had done it many times before. I'd have heard you. I was in the West reading room the whole time. I didn't think to, Wren said, which was not quite a lie, since in the moment of standing in total darkness in a room she was not supposed to know existed, holding a journal that was not supposed to exist either, calling for help had not been the first instinct that occurred to her. She did not tell him, that first evening, about the gap in the wall or the cabinet or the small cloth-bound book now sitting, wrapped carefully in acid-free tissue, at the bottom of her satchel. She told herself this was professional caution. The correct handling of an unaccessioned find required documentation, permission, a proper process, and she believed this reasoning for almost exactly 11 hours, until she was sitting at the small writing desk in her room at the Ostend, the journal open beneath the lamp, utterly unable to think about anything else. The Ostend was a narrow building 3 streets from the archive, its ground floor a cafe that smelled permanently of coffee and warm bread, its 4 guest rooms upstairs reached by a staircase so steep it seemed designed to discourage anyone from leaving once they'd arrived. Wren's room had a single window overlooking the canal, rain-streaked glass through which the street lamps blurred into soft gold smears, and a radiator that clanked companionably through the night like something alive and slightly arthritic. She had spent 4 hours with the journal and had made almost no progress. The cipher, whatever it was, did not behave like any of the systems she'd encountered in her career. Not the simple substitution codes lovers used in Victorian correspondence, not the numerical ciphers of wartime letters, not even the private shorthand some diarists developed out of habit rather than secrecy. It had structure. It had rules. Certain symbol pairs recurred with a frequency that suggested vowels, certain longer strings repeated in patterns that suggested proper names. But without a key, without even a single confirmed word beyond the one devastating sentence the writer had let slip into plain script at the very end, it remained, for now, a wall of elegant, urgent nonsense. They will say I died of the lungs. I did not asterisk. Not the writer's own death, then, a death witnessed. Written about someone else. A woman writing, in a private code, about another woman's death that had been recorded, officially, as something other than what it was. Wren had built a career on the belief that every document was a form of testimony, even the boring ones, even the land deeds and the parish registers, because someone had thought it worth writing down and someone else had thought it worth keeping. This felt like testimony of an entirely different order. Someone had wanted this remembered badly enough to encode it, hide it, and trust it to survive in a locked cabinet in a sealed room for the better part of a century. She fell asleep, eventually, with the journal still open on the desk and the lamp still burning, and dreamed, not of the room, not of the darkness, but of a woman's voice she had never heard, reading something aloud in a language she almost understood. She told Theodore Marsh about the cabinet on the third morning, mostly because she had run out of ways not to. They met, as they had twice before that week, at the small cafe 2 doors from the archive, where Theodore came most mornings before opening his own shop, a modest print and bookbinding business he'd inherited from his father, and his father before him, on a street that had, according to Theodore, once housed half the town's tradesmen and now housed mostly empty storefronts and one determined bakery. He was a broad, unhurried man in his mid-40s, with ink permanently under his fingernails and the particular quiet patience of someone who had spent his whole life around books and had never once found them boring. "You found something," he said, before she'd finished sitting down. "You've got the look." "What look?" "The look people get right before they tell me something they've been trying very hard not to think about all night." He smiled, not unkindly. "My father used to get it." Usually meant a customer had brought in something with a family secret sewn into the binding. "You'd be amazed what people hide in books." So she told him. The gap in the wall. The forgotten room. The cabinet, the padlock, the 30-odd journals, the cipher, and, carefully, watching his face as she said it, the single line of plain script at the end. Theodore did not say anything for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer, an old habit, she would come to learn, that meant he was choosing his next words with unusual care. "My family worked at Lark Hollow," he said finally. "Did you know that?" "Before it closed." "I didn't know its name until yesterday." "Lark Hollow Sanatorium. Out past the old mill road. There's nothing left of it now but foundations and a stand of oak trees nobody's ever wanted to clear. It closed in 1930. My great-great-grandmother worked in the laundry there for a few years before that." He said this evenly, as though reciting a fact he'd been told rather than one that touched him personally. It wasn't spoken about much, growing up. My grandmother used to say the place had a bad name in the town, and leave it at that. I never thought much of it. Every old town has a place with a bad name. Do you know what kind of institution it was? Nervous disorders, officially. Something crossed his face, quick and gone. Unofficially, from what little I ever heard, the kind of place families sent daughters and wives they found inconvenient. Not always because anything was wrong with them. He looked up at her. "You think your journals came from there?" "I think whoever wrote them did." Wren hesitated, then reached into her satchel and set the journal, still in its tissue wrapping, carefully on the cafe table between them. "I can't read it yet. But I think I can, eventually, if I have time and no one tells me to stop." Theodore did not touch the journal, but he looked at it the way a man looks at something he recognizes without wanting to. Adeline, no? No. Pete? No. He was quiet again. Outside, the morning's thin rain had turned to a fine, persistent mist that softened the whole street into something out of an old photograph. You should be careful who you tell, and in what order, he said eventually. Not because anyone in this town is dangerous, exactly. But Lark Hollow's an old wound here, and old wounds don't like being reopened by strangers. People will help you more than you'd expect, and less than you'd hope, and you won't always be able to tell in advance which is which. It was, Wren thought, an oddly specific thing to say for a man who claimed to know so little. She found the first admission ledger 2 days later, in a box of Lark Hollow's surviving administrative records that had, unlike the sealed medical files, been properly transferred and catalogued decades before, mundane, uncontroversial, the sort of document nobody thought to hide because nobody had thought, in 1931, that it mattered. It was Pete who found it for her, in fact, after she'd asked, with what she hoped was convincing casualness, whether the archive held any general records relating to Lark Hollow's operation, aside from the sealed medical files in the East Wing. There's an admissions register somewhere, he said, frowning at the shelf list. Nothing sensitive, just names, dates, who signed for whom. The medical stuff, the case files, that's all supposed to be in the East Wing, under the 1931 restriction order. He pulled a slim, water-stained ledger from a box and handed it over without apparent hesitation. This is the boring version. Names and dates. If you're looking for anything interesting, you'll be disappointed. She was not disappointed. The register was arranged chronologically, each entry a single line, a name, an admission date, the signature of the relative or guardian who had committed the patient, and a final column. Discharge, transfer, or, in a disquieting number of cases, simply the word deceased. She worked backward from 1930, patiently, cross-referencing dates against what little the cipher had so far yielded, a handful of recurring symbol strings she suspected, without proof, might correspond to a name. It took her the better part of an afternoon, and she had very nearly given up for the day, eyes aching from the poor light of the reading room, when her finger stopped on a single line, 3/4 of the way down a page dated 1923. Marin, Y. Admitted April 14, 1923. Signed, Corvin, per family request. Discharge, deceased, October 3, 1923. See physician's note ***. Wren sat very still. Y. Marin. 2 initials that, when she checked them against the recurring symbol pair she'd tentatively marked in the cipher as a proper name, the pair that appeared, she now realized, with striking frequency in the very journal she'd found, matched with a precision that made the back of her neck prickle. See physician's note ***. She turned to the back of the ledger, where a slim index of supplementary documents was recorded by hand, cross-referencing case numbers to physician's notes filed separately. She found the entry for Y. Marin's case number easily enough. Beside it, in the same careful hand that had recorded every other entry in the register, was a single word, added, she would swear to this later, comparing the ink, in a slightly different shade, as though written weeks or months after the original entry. Missing ***. Not filed elsewhere. Not transferred. Not destroyed by fire or flood or the ordinary chaos of an institution's closing. Missing. A word that implied someone had gone looking for it, at some point, and had not found it, and had thought it worth noting that fact rather than simply leaving a blank space. She closed the ledger slowly, aware of her own heartbeat, aware of the particular hush of the reading room in late afternoon, the rain now steady against the tall windows, the whole building settling around her with its familiar creaks and sighs. Why? Marin had been admitted to Lark Hollow in April of 1923, signed for by a Corvin. She would need to establish, carefully, whether that was coincidence or something else, and had died 6 months later, at 19 or 20 years old, by whatever the physician's note might have said, had it still existed to say it. And in a locked cabinet in a forgotten room, a woman writing in a private cipher had recorded, in the one moment she'd allowed herself plain language, that the official cause of that death was a lie. That night, back at the Ostend, Wren finally made progress on the cipher itself. Not through any great insight, but through the patient, unglamorous work of frequency analysis, tallying which symbols recurred most often and testing them, one by one, against the vowel patterns of the language she now felt reasonably confident the journal had been written in. By midnight she had confirmed the name. Y.M. Yvette Marin, most likely, though she would not have the full given name confirmed for several more days. Appeared no fewer than 11 times in the journal's first 30 pages, always in the same careful, guarded hand, always surrounded by symbols she had not yet cracked but which she was beginning, with a historian's patient instinct, to read as tone rather than content. Affection. Worry. In one instance, unmistakably, something that looked very much like fear. She was still working, lamp burning low, rain ticking steadily against the window, when her phone buzzed against the desk. A message from an unknown local number, the kind of number that could belong to anyone in a town this size. Some things are buried for a reason. Not everyone will thank you for digging them up. Wren read it twice. Then she looked, without quite meaning to, toward the window, where the street lamp outside threw its small gold circle onto the wet cobblestones below, and where, for just a moment before a passing cloud of mist swallowed it again, she was almost certain she saw a figure standing very still on the opposite side of the canal, facing her window, though by the time she crossed the room to look properly, there was no one there at all. Chapter 3. Consumption. Lark Hollow Sanatorium, April 1923. The girl arrived on a Tuesday, which Odile Ferrand would remember later as the only ordinary thing about her. Odile had been at Lark Hollow for 2 years by then, long enough to have stopped flinching at the sound of the iron gate, long enough to have learned which of the staff could be reasoned with and which could not, long enough to have built, out of nothing but patience and a good memory, a private cipher that she and Inez Brandt used to write down the things they were not permitted to say aloud. She had been a schoolteacher once, in a village 3 hours south, before her brother signed the papers that ended that life and began this one. She had been, on paper, hysterical. In practice, she had refused to marry a magistrate's son who had put his hand where it did not belong on one of her 12-year-old pupils, and she had said so, loudly, to the wrong people, and her family had found it more convenient to have her declared unwell than to have the magistrate's son declared anything at all. She watched from the recreation room window as the new girl was helped down from the carriage. Helped, not led, which was itself unusual, since most new arrivals came in under a firmer hand than that. The girl was perhaps 19. Dark-haired, pale, moving with the particular careful stiffness of someone recently and thoroughly frightened. She looked up at Larkhallow's grey stone face the way every new patient looked up at it, as though trying to memorize something before it was taken from her. And for one moment, before an orderly's hand closed on her elbow and steered her toward the door, her eyes found the window where Odile stood, and held there. Nervous collapse, Ines said later, in the dining hall, in the low voice they used for things that mattered. She had a talent for finding out names and diagnoses within hours of anyone's arrival. Odile had never asked how. Families paying full board. Private room, if you can believe it. What's her name? Marin. Yvette Marin. Ines said it carefully, testing the shape of it. Merchant family, from the sound of it. Father dead, mother remarried to someone with money. No husband of her own, which is interesting, given what Sister Halloran's face looked like when she took her temperature this morning. Odile understood, without needing it spelled out further, exactly what kind of nervous collapse required no husband and a private room and a family suddenly willing to pay for both. She did not speak to Yvette Marin properly for 11 days. Larkhollow discouraged familiarity between new arrivals and the older patients, on the theory, never stated but universally understood, that the old patients might teach the new ones bad habits, by which the staff meant honesty. It was Ines, in the end, who broke the pattern, cornering the new girl during the supervised half-hour of garden exercise that Larkhollow permitted its better-behaved patients, and returning to Odile's side within minutes with the particular brightness she wore when she had decided to like someone. "She's terrified," Ines reported. "But she's sharp. She asked me, very quietly, mind you, while pretending to admire the roses, whether the doctors here read outgoing letters before they're posted." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That they read everything, and that if she wanted a letter to actually reach whoever she was writing it to, she'd need to be cleverer than that." They brought Yvette into the arrangement that evening. The cipher, disguised to any watching staff as a memory game the two of them had invented to pass the long hours, symbols traded back and forth on scraps of paper during the supervised sewing hour, when Sister Halloran's attention was occupied elsewhere and the other nurses had long since stopped paying the older patients any mind at all. Yvette learned it faster than either of them expected. She had, Odile came to realize within a week, an unusually quick mind wrapped inside a frightened, careful manner, the mind of someone who had learned young that being clever and being safe were not always compatible, and had chosen, for most of her life, safety. Larkhollow, it seemed, had finally asked more of her than she was willing to give up quietly. It was in her third week that Yvette told them, in cipher, over 3 days of careful notes passed during sewing hour, why she had really been brought to Larkhollow. "My mother's husband arranged it. Not for my sake. For his standing. There is a child coming and the father is a man whose name must not be connected to mine in any register anyone might read **. Odile remembered the particular stillness with which Ines had received this. Not shock, exactly, since neither of them had truly believed the official story, but something closer to a grim confirmation of a pattern they had both seen played out before, in other women, other families, other convenient diagnoses. "Who is the father?" Ines wrote back, the question passed folded inside a spool of thread. 3 days passed before Yvette answered, and when she did, the cipher symbols were smaller than usual, pressed hard into the paper, as though she had needed to force herself to write them at all. A man of standing in Verholt. I will not write his name even in cipher. If this were found and understood, it would end me faster than any fever asterisk. She would not be moved on the point, not then and not in the weeks that followed, no matter how gently Odile pressed. It was Inessa's private theory. Never confirmed, never proven, offered once in a whisper during a rare unsupervised hour in the laundry yard, that the man in question held some office or position that made his name dangerous in a very particular way, not merely embarrassing, but capable of destroying whoever spoke it. Odile thought, privately, of the magistrate whose son had ended her own life as she'd known it, and wondered, without any way of confirming it, whether Verholt's supply of dangerous men with respectable names was smaller and more tightly connected than anyone in the town liked to admit. Summer came, thick and slow, the kind of season that made Lark Hollow's high windows glow golden the evenings and made its long days feel endless in a way that had nothing to do with beauty. Yvette grew heavier and quieter as the months passed, moved to a room nearer the infirmary for her health, visited with increasing frequency by Dr. Rourke himself, whose attentions Odile had learned, over 2 years, to regard with a wariness she could never quite articulate to anyone who had not lived under his particular brand of gentle, modern, thoroughly controlling care. It was in early September that Yvette told them, in a note passed with trembling hands, that the child's father had come to see her, twice now, she said, always in the evening, always let in through the side door by an orderly Rourke trusted absolutely, always announced to the rest of the staff, if he was announced at all, under a name that was not his own. He says he will provide for the child. He says my mother's husband has been paid to keep this quiet and will go on being paid so long as I say nothing further to anyone. He says this as though it is a kindness asterisk. Do you believe him asterisk? Odile wrote back. The answer, when it came, was the last entry of any real length that Yvette would ever pass to them. I believe he is frightened of what happens to him if I am not kept quiet. I do not think that is the same thing as trusting him to keep me safe. I have written to my sister. If anything happens to me that seems strange, she is the one who will ask questions, because she is the only person left who has never once been paid to stop asterisk. 3 days later, the letter was gone from where Yvette had hidden it, awaiting the next opportunity to smuggle it out with a sympathetic laundry girl who sometimes carried post beyond the gate for a small fee. Yvette never confirmed how it had been found. She grew quieter after that, and more frightened, and Odile, turning the memory over decades later than she could have known anyone would, in the careful cipher of a journal meant for no reader she could name, would write that this was the moment she understood, with a certainty she could not have explained to anyone still sane enough to be believed, that something at Lark Hollow had shifted from merely cruel to something with teeth. Verholt, present day. Wren found Inspector Luda Savick through Theodore, who knew her, it turned out, the way everyone in a town this size seemed to know everyone else with any authority. Not well, but well enough to know where to find her on a Thursday afternoon, which was the small allotment garden behind the old mill, where Savick had spent every retired Thursday for 6 years growing tomatoes with a dedication she had apparently once reserved for solving crimes. She was a broad, weathered woman in her late 50s, sleeves rolled to the elbow, dirt under her nails in a way that reminded Wren, absurdly, of Theodore's ink-stained fingers. Lark Hollow, Savik said, when Wren had finished explaining, without much preamble, what she'd found. She said the name the way a person says the name of an old case they never quite closed to their own satisfaction. I looked into that place once, years ago. Not officially. There was no case to open, nothing anyone had reported. Just an old itch. She straightened, wiping her hands on her trousers. You said the ledger records a death in October of 1923. 'Cause given as consumption. Yes. And no coroner's report. None that I've found. I've checked the town's records for that whole quarter. Every death registered in Verholt in 1923 that required a coroner's examination is listed by case number, cross-referenced to a file. Yvette Marin's death isn't cross-referenced to anything. It's as though no examination was ever requested. Savik was quiet for a moment, considering this with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had spent a career learning not to speak faster than she thought. In 1923, a death inside an institution like Lark Hollow, if it was sudden and the family didn't push for an inquiry, might well pass without a coroner. That alone isn't damning. Families paid good money precisely so their inconvenient relatives could die quietly, without fuss, without questions. She looked at Wren directly. What's damning is a document that was supposed to explain it and has since gone missing. That's not the absence of an inquiry. That's the absence of a record someone once thought worth keeping, and no longer wants anyone else to find. You think it was deliberately removed? I think, Savik said, that in my experience, records don't wander off on their own. Someone carries them. The question that's always mattered more to me than who did the original wrong is who's still protecting it, 100 years later. Because whoever tore that page, whoever's been keeping that file from turning up all this time, that's not history anymore. That's a live decision somebody is still making. She studied Wren for a moment, not unkindly. You said someone's already sent you a message telling you to stop looking. One text. Vague enough to be nothing. Nothing doesn't usually bother sending a message. Savik pulled off her gardening gloves finally, decisively, as though the conversation had crossed some internal threshold from idle curiosity into something she intended to take seriously. Who else knows what you've found, besides Marsh and whichever archivist you trust? Adeline Corvin knows I've asked about the sanatorium records. She doesn't know about the cabinet. Something in Savik's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the particular stillness of a woman filing a name away in a part of her mind that had once been very good at knowing exactly which names mattered. Corvin, she said. That's an old family name in this town. Goes back a long way. Magistrates, most of them, once upon a time. She looked at Wren for a long moment, weighing something. I'd be careful how much you tell that family, and in what order, before you're certain what you're dealing with. It was, Wren thought, the second time in 4 days that someone in Verholt had told her almost exactly the same thing, in almost exactly the same careful tone. As though the whole town had quietly agreed, long before her arrival, on the precise shape of the caution they were willing to offer a stranger, and the precise point beyond which that caution stopped. She thanked Savik and walked back toward the archive through streets gone slick and silver with the evening's first rain, turning the woman's words over with the particular unease of someone who had just realized that the mystery she'd been chasing might not be 100 years cold after all. That somewhere in Verholt, right now, under an umbrella or behind a shop window or across a canal in the dark, someone was still, actively, quietly, deciding what Wren Ashcombe was and was not permitted to find. Chapter 4. The Confiscated Letter. Adeline Corvin's office occupied what had once been the archive director's private study, a high-ceilinged room at the front of the building where the good furniture had survived the decades better than anything else, a heavy walnut desk, a pair of leather chairs gone soft and cracked with age, tall bookshelves that held, Wren noticed on her first visit, more framed photographs of Adeline's own family than books. She noticed this the way she noticed most things now, filing it away without quite deciding yet what it meant. "You wanted the Lark Hollow medical ledger," Adeline said, before Wren had finished sitting down. She said it the way a woman says a request she has already decided how to refuse. The 1923 volume, specifically. If it exists. It did exist. Adeline folded her hands on the desk with the particular composure of someone who had rehearsed this conversation, or one very like it, more than once. "I'm afraid it was lost in the 1978 collapse, along with a great deal else in the East Wing. The roof came down over the section where the medical records were shelved. What survived was mostly the administrative material, admissions, discharges, the sort of thing you've already found. The clinical files themselves were largely destroyed. The admissions register cross-references a physician's note for Yvette Marin's case. It's marked missing, not destroyed." Something in Adeline's face did not change, exactly, but seemed to settle more firmly into its existing shape, the way a mask settles when the person wearing it has decided to hold perfectly still. "I imagine the distinction meant very little to whoever wrote it, 90 years ago. Missing, destroyed, the practical result is the same. The document isn't here. Do you know where I might find records of what was specifically lost in the collapse? An insurance inventory, a damage assessment? I doubt anything so thorough survives from that period. The town had other priorities in 1978 than cataloging exactly what a partial roof collapse had ruined." Adeline's tone remained perfectly pleasant, perfectly reasonable, and Wren found herself thinking, not for the first time, that this was precisely the quality that made the woman difficult to read. She never once sounded like someone hiding anything. She sounded, always, like someone simply stating facts that happened, by coincidence, to be convenient. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Miss Ashcombe," Adeline added, rising, a clear signal that the conversation was concluding whether Wren wished it to or not. "But I would remind you that your contract concerns the West Wing and the general parish collection. The East Wing material, whatever survives of it, falls outside your remit. And, frankly, outside the timeline we have remaining before the sale closes. I'd hate to see 6 weeks of useful cataloging lost to a project that isn't yours to pursue." It was, Wren thought, walking back down the corridor a few minutes later, a remarkably elegant way of saying stop, dressed up so carefully as reasonable professional advice that it would have worked, she suspected, on almost anyone who hadn't already found a locked cabinet full of coded testimony that Adeline Corvin didn't know existed. Pete found her an hour later in the West reading room, ostensibly to ask about a shelving question that Wren suspected, from the moment he opened his mouth, was not the real reason he'd come. You asked her about the medical ledger, he said, once he'd closed the door behind him, a small gesture, but one Wren noted, since Pete rarely bothered to close doors in a building this empty. The 1923 volume. She says it was destroyed in the roof collapse. Pete was quiet for a moment, turning a pencil over in his fingers with the particular restless energy of a man deciding how much of something he already knew he was willing to say aloud. That ledger wasn't in the East Wing in 1978, he said finally, quietly, as though the words cost him something. I know because my grandmother used to talk about the collapse. She was a girl then, her father worked maintenance for the town. The section that came down was the north end of the East Wing, above the old records office. The medical files, the ones under restriction, those were kept separately, in a locked room off the south corridor. Different part of the building entirely. It wasn't touched. Wren felt something settle into place, cold and precise. You're saying Adeline's claim isn't just unproven. It's specifically wrong. I'm saying my grandmother said so, once, years ago, and I never had any reason to think about it twice until you started asking questions this week. Pete glanced at the closed door, then back at her, his voice dropping further. I looked something up, after you spoke to her this morning. There's an old photocopy request log, nobody uses it anymore, everything's digital now, but the archive kept a paper log for years, whenever someone requested access to restricted material. It's in the storage room behind the reading desk. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just wanted to see. And? There's a request from 11 years ago. Before my time here. For access to Lark Hollow's 1923 medical records, the exact volume Adeline just told you doesn't exist. He hesitated, and something in his expression made Wren's pulse quicken before he even finished the sentence. The request was approved. Signed off by the archive director at the time. And the name of the person who made the request. He stopped. Pete. It's Corvin, he said. Not Adeline. Her father. Wheeled Corvin. He requested access to the 1923 ledger 11 years ago, and according to this log, he got it. Lark Hollow Sanatorium, September 1923. The letter had taken Yvette 3 weeks to write, a few lines at a time, hidden beneath the false bottom of a sewing box that Ines had built for exactly this purpose out of stolen cardboard and patience. She wrote it in plain script, not cipher, because it was meant for her sister and her sister alone, and because, she told Odile, in one of the last unguarded conversations the two of them would have before everything changed, a letter written in code would only frighten her sister without giving her anything she could act on. I have told her everything, Yvette wrote to Odile, in cipher, the night before the letter was meant to leave Lark Hollow in the apron pocket of a laundry girl paid a week's wages to carry it beyond the gate. His name. What was done to arrange my committal? What I believe was done to arrange my silence since. If anything happens to me here that does not make sense, she will not simply accept whatever she is told. She has never once, in her whole life, accepted anything simply because a man in authority told her to. You sound frightened, Odile wrote back. I am frightened, Yvette answered. But I am also, for the first time since I arrived here, not entirely powerless. That is worth something, even if it costs me asterisk. The letter did not leave Lark Hollow the next morning. Odile learned of its disappearance the way she learned most things of consequence inside those walls. Sideways, through a fragment overheard, a face gone suddenly rigid, a silence where a sound should have been. The laundry girl, questioned by Sister Halloran under circumstances nobody would later describe clearly, had apparently confessed to carrying correspondence for patients in exchange for money, and had been dismissed within the day. Whatever letters she had been carrying at the time, Yvette's among them, presumably, though this was never confirmed to any patient's satisfaction. Were, according to the story that filtered back through the ward, turned over to Dr. Rourke himself, for review, a phrase that in Lark Hollow's particular vocabulary meant the letter would never be seen again by anyone it had been intended for. Yvette did not speak for 2 full days after the news reached her. When she finally passed a note to Odile again, the cipher symbols were smaller than before, pressed hard and fast into the paper, as though written in a single trembling burst. He knows now that I told her. Not the details, perhaps, but that I tried. I do not know what that means for me. I only know that Dr. Rourke visited me alone this evening, without a nurse present, which he has never done before, and that he asked me, very gently, whether I had been sleeping well, and whether I had experienced any pains in my chest asterisk. What did you tell him asterisk? Odile wrote back, her hand unsteady. I told him no. It was true, when I said it. It is less true tonight asterisk. Odile kept that note for the rest of her life, folded inside the back cover of the last journal she ever filled, though she would never fully explain, even to herself, why those particular lines felt more important to preserve than almost anything else Yvette Marin ever wrote to her. Except that reading them again, years later, in a place far from Lark Hollow's walls, she understood at last that they were the moment the story had stopped being merely frightening and had become, quietly and without any single dramatic turn, a countdown. Verholt, present day. Wren found Weald Corvin's name 3 more times before the afternoon was out, each time in a context that told her a little more and reassured her a little less. A minor local philanthropist, according to an old newspaper clipping, who had funded a small restoration of the town's war memorial some 15 years before his death, a name listed among the archive's honorary patrons in a plaque she had walked past a dozen times without reading properly, and, in the town's civic records, a single entry noting that Weald Corvin had served, briefly and without particular distinction, on the very closing committee his daughter now chaired. None of it proved anything. All of it made the shape of something visible where before there had only been Adeline's smooth, reasonable denials. She was still turning it over that evening, sitting at the small desk in her room at the Ostend with the photocopy log's date written on a scrap of paper beside the journal, when she noticed, for the first time, something she had overlooked in her earlier, more cursory search of the town's vital records. The 1923 birth and death register. The same volume she had checked before, weeks ago now it felt, searching for any coroner's cross-reference to Yvette Marin's death, sat exactly where she had left it, in a box near the reading room's east window. She had checked it once, quickly, and found nothing, and moved on. Now, with a historian's patient, uneasy instinct that told her to look again more carefully at anything she had once dismissed too quickly, she opened it a second time and turned, slowly, page by page, through the entries for October of 1923. The register was bound, its pages sewn rather than glued, and it took her a moment to notice what her fingers had already registered before her eyes caught up. A narrow, ragged edge where a single leaf had been cut, cleanly and deliberately, close against the binding. Not torn by age. Not lost to damp or mice or the ordinary decay of a century-old book. Cut, with something sharp, by someone who had known exactly which page to remove and had taken care not to leave the ledger looking obviously incomplete to a casual glance. The missing page fell, by the careful count of the surrounding dates, precisely where an entry for the 3rd of October, 1923, should have been. Wren sat very still in the lamplight, listening to the rain against the window and the radiator's familiar clank, and understood, with a certainty that settled cold and absolute somewhere beneath her ribs, that whoever had cut that page had not done so 100 years ago, in some long-forgotten act of institutional discretion. The cut was too clean. The paper's edge, where the blade had passed through it, showed none of the yellowing and brittle discoloration of the century-old pages surrounding it. Someone had removed that page recently, days, perhaps only hours, before Wren had thought to look at the register a second time. Someone in Verholt had known, before she did, exactly which page still mattered. Chapter 5. The First Warning. Wren did not sleep the night she found the cut page. She sat with it for a long time, turning the ledger under the lamp, photographing the ragged edge from 3 angles with the careful, unhurried patience of someone documenting evidence she was not yet certain she would ever be allowed to use. When she finally did sleep, near dawn, it was the thin, unsatisfying sleep of someone whose body has simply run out of the energy required to keep worrying. She woke to a knock at her door, soft, tentative, entirely unlike the brisk rap of the Ostend's owner bringing up towels. There was no one there. Only, tucked into the gap between the door and its frame at exactly the height a hand would reach without needing to bend, a single folded sheet of plain paper. She knew, before she'd even opened it, what kind of thing it would be. She had, without quite admitting it to herself, been expecting something like it since the phone message 4 days before, expecting it the way a person expects thunder after they've already seen the lightning, with a strange, resigned calm that surprised her more than the fear did. The note was typed, not handwritten, on paper that could have come from any printer in Verholt. Some doors were shut for good reason. Leave them shut, asterisk. Wren read it twice, then set it down on the desk beside the cut ledger page and the cipher journal, and found herself thinking, absurdly, of her old supervisor at the museum, and the careful, bloodless language of institutions that wanted her to disappear without incident. This note wanted the same thing. It simply lacked the institution's patience for bloodless language. She photographed it, the way she'd photographed the cut page, and then sat with it for a long moment before doing the thing she suspected, deep down, she had been building toward for days without admitting it. She called Theodore. He came within the hour, letting himself into the cafe below her room before it had properly opened, the owner apparently used enough to his habits not to question it. He read the note twice, his broad face unusually still, and then set it down with a care that suggested he did not want his fingerprints adding themselves to whatever might already be on it. "You should tell Savik," he said. "I will. But I wanted to ask you something first." Wren watched his face carefully as she spoke. "The other day you told me your family worked at Lark Hollow. Your great-great-grandmother, In the laundry. You said it like it was a small thing. A footnote. Theodore was quiet for a moment. Rain had started again outside, the fine, persistent kind that seemed to be Verholt's default weather rather than an exception to it. It wasn't only my great-great-grandmother, he said finally. That part's true, as far as it goes. But there's more of the family in that place's history than I let on, and I'm not entirely sure why I didn't just say so the first time, except that some things you grow up not saying out loud become a habit before you ever decide to keep them secret on purpose. He met her eyes. My grandmother's maiden name was Halloran. Wren felt the room seem to tighten slightly around that single word. Bridget Halloran was Lark Hollow's head nurse in 1923, she said slowly. I found her name in one of the surviving administrative records this week. She was on duty the night Yvette Marin died. I know. Theodore said it quietly, almost apologetically, as though confessing to a small, ordinary dishonesty rather than a fact that reorganized nearly everything Wren had assumed about who in this town could be trusted and why. My grandmother used to talk about her, sometimes, not often, and never in much detail. She said Sister Halloran was dismissed from Lark Hollow not long before it closed. Officially for insubordination. My grandmother always said, whenever the subject came up, that Sister Halloran had done something brave near the end of her time there, and paid for it, and that the family didn't like to discuss the particulars because it had never done anyone any good to be known as the family that made trouble for a respected doctor. Do you know what she did? No. That's the honest truth, whatever else I haven't told you. My grandmother died when I was 19. Whatever she knew in detail, she took most of it with her. She only ever gave us the shape of the story, never the substance. A brave woman, punished for it, in a place everyone in town had already agreed not to talk about. He exhaled slowly. I should have told you the first day. I told myself it wasn't relevant, since I genuinely didn't know anything useful. I'm not sure that was ever really the reason. What was the reason? Theodore was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup its habitual quarter turn on the saucer. My family spent 3 generations trying very hard not to be the people who made trouble in this town over Lark Hollow, he said finally. It's a strange thing to inherit, not a secret exactly, but a kind of carefulness. A sense that some doors are better left shut, to borrow a phrase. A faint, humorless smile. I didn't want to be the one who opened this one. And then you did it for me, and I found I couldn't quite stay as uninvolved as I'd planned to. That afternoon, Wren finally told Pete everything, the warning note, Savic's suspicions, and, carefully, the name Theodore had given her. Pete went very still when she said it. Halloran, he repeated, in a voice that had gone strangely flat. Bridget Halloran. You know the name. I know it better than I let on, apparently, given how this week has gone for everyone's honesty. He sat down heavily in the chair opposite her desk, and for a moment he looked, Wren thought, considerably younger than 29. My mother's maiden name was Okonkwo. Her mother, my grandmother, was born Vance. There's a Halloran 2 generations back on that side, though I've never once heard the connection spoken of as anything other than a name on an old family tree nobody paid much attention to. He pulled out his phone, scrolling with visibly unsteady fingers through what Wren realized, watching him, Must be some family history app or genealogy record he had apparently consulted before, in some idler, less urgent context. My great-great-grandmother, he said slowly, staring at the screen. Bridget Halloran, born 1898, died 1961. Employed as a nurse. There's a note here, my aunt put this together years ago, some family history project, that says she was dismissed from a position in 1929 under circumstances the family never discussed. He looked up at Wren, and something had shifted behind his careful, apologetic manner, a kind of dawning, uneasy recognition. You think the cabinet was hers, he said. You think my great-great-grandmother hid those journals? I think it's possible. The care with which they were preserved, someone who had access to that part of the building, someone with a reason to protect exactly that kind of testimony rather than destroy it as she was presumably ordered to. Wren watched him carefully. Pete, if that's true, it might explain something else. The room I found the cabinet in, it wasn't part of the original medical records office, from what I can tell of the building's layout. It was a smaller, adjoining space, easy to overlook, easy to seal off later without anyone quite realizing what had been sealed inside it. That's not the kind of hiding place you find by accident. That's the kind you build, deliberately, if you already know exactly what you're trying to protect and from whom. Pete did not answer for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had yet heard it. If my family's been sitting on some part of this for 100 years without knowing it, he said, I want to know what it is. Whatever it costs me here. He looked up, and something in his expression had hardened into a resolve Wren had not seen in him before. Adeline's my employer, technically. Her committee decides whether my contract gets renewed after the sale goes through. I've spent 2 years being careful around her, the way everyone in this building learns to be careful around her, without ever really asking myself why the carefulness felt necessary in the first place. He shook his head slowly. I think I'd like to stop being careful. Lark Hollow Sanatorium, late September 1923. Sister Bridget Halloran had worked at Lark Hollow for 11 years by the autumn of 1923, long enough to have developed the particular occupational numbness that let her move through wards of frightened, grieving, furious women without flinching, and long enough, also, to have begun noticing the small, accumulating weight of things she had chosen, for the sake of her position, not to notice more closely. She had not liked the arrangement around Yvette Marin's confiscated letter from the moment Dr. Rourke informed her of it, not the confiscation itself, which was common enough at Lark Hollow that it barely registered as remarkable, but the particular care with which Rourke had handled it afterward. He had not simply filed the letter away, as he did with the ordinary correspondence deemed unsuitable for a patient's fragile state. He had read it himself, alone, behind the closed door of his office, and had emerged from that reading in a mood Sister Halloran had rarely seen in him before. Not anger, precisely, but something colder and more focused, the mood of a man recalculating a risk he had previously believed manageable. He visited Yvette Marin alone that evening, without a nurse present, which was itself against the institution's own stated policy for patients in her condition. Sister Halloran, passing the corridor outside, heard only fragments through the heavy door. Rourke's voice, low and even, and beneath it, once, the small, frightened sound of a young woman being reassured about something in a tone that did not, to Sister Halloran's experienced ear, sound reassuring at all. She wrote nothing down that night. It would be another 10 days before she began, quietly and at considerable personal risk, to keep a private record of her own. Not a cipher, since she had no gift for such things, but a plain, careful account, hidden inside the lining of a nursing bag she kept locked in a cabinet whose key she alone possessed, in a small forgotten room off the south corridor that had once served as an overflow records office and had, by 1923, been all but abandoned to dust and disuse by everyone except her. She would not know, when she began that record, how many other women in the ward around her, Odile Ferrand, Ines Brandt, and others whose names she never fully learned, were keeping records of their own, in a code she could not read, describing many of the same events from angles she never saw. She would not know that one day, 100 years later, a stranger would find them all together in the same locked cabinet, and would understand, finally, what none of them had been able to prove alone. She knew only, that September evening, standing in a cold corridor listening to a conversation she could not fully hear, that something at Lark Hollow had shifted, and that whatever happened next to Yvette Marin, she intended, quietly, carefully, at whatever cost to herself, to make certain it did not simply disappear. Verholt, present day. Wren went to Sauvik that same evening, the warning note sealed carefully in a plastic sleeve she'd improvised from a document protector meant for far gentler purposes. Sauvik examined it under her kitchen lamp with the same unhurried thoroughness she'd brought to the allotment garden, turning it over twice before setting it down. Common paper. Common printer. No print's worth lifting, not after it's been handled this much, and I've no authority to run it through a lab even if there were. She looked up at Wren, and her expression had lost the last of its earlier, amused reserve. But I'll tell you what interests me. Whoever sent this knew which hotel you were staying at, and which room. That's not public information, not in a town where the Ostend doesn't post its guest list. That means whoever's watching you isn't watching from a distance, guessing. They're close enough to know things only a handful of people in Verholt would have any reason to know. Wren thought of Adeline Corvin's composed, reasonable office. She thought of Pete's careful denials in his first days, and Theodore's quiet, three-generation habit of not opening certain doors. She thought, too, of the figure she thought she'd glimpsed across the canal on her second night in town, gone before she could be certain it had ever been there at all. That's not a very short list of people, she said. No, Sauvik agreed. It isn't. Which means, Miss Ashcombe, that from here on, I'd advise you to assume that everyone in this town already knows considerably more about what you're doing than you know about them, and to act accordingly. She held up the note one more time, studying it in the lamplight. Someone wanted you frightened enough to stop. That tells me two things. First, that whatever's buried here is worth frightening a stranger over, which is not a small thing for a town this size to risk. And second, she set the note down finally, meeting Wren's eyes, that whoever sent it isn't yet willing to do anything worse than frighten you. That may not remain true forever. I'd move carefully, and I'd stop working alone. Chapter 6. What the Father Knew. The cipher broke open all at once, the way Wren had learned, over years of similar work, that ciphers usually did. Not through some single flash of brilliance, but through the slow accumulation of small certainties until one evening, Working by lamplight with Theodore across the desk and Pete's notes on the Halloran family spread between them, she found that an entire page of Odile Farrant's careful, cramped hands simply resolved into plain sense. The way a word puzzle suddenly surrenders itself once you've found the one missing letter that makes the rest fall into place. "Read it to me again," Theodore said quietly, once she'd worked through the translation a second time to be certain of it. Slowly. Wren smoothed the page beneath the lamp and read. September 1923. Y tells me the child's father visited her again tonight, brought in the side entrance as before, announced under a false name to any staff who might ask. She says he told her that her mother's husband has been paid to keep his silence, and will go on being paid so long as she says nothing further to anyone. She says he spoke of this as though it were a kindness. I asked whether she believed him. She wrote back only that she believed he was frightened of what happens to him if she is not kept quiet, and that this is not the same thing as trusting him to keep her safe. Theodore was quiet for a long moment. A man paying to keep two people silent, he said finally. The mother's husband, and presumably whoever administered the arrangement at Lark Hollow itself. That's not the behavior of a frightened lover acting alone. That takes money, and it takes someone at the institution willing to look the other way in exchange for it. Rourke, Wren said. Rourke, Theodore agreed. Which would explain a great deal about why a physician's note that should exist has instead gone missing for 100 years. And why a page cut from the town register just happened to vanish the same week you started asking about it. Pete, who had been quiet through most of this, sitting slightly apart with his grandmother's genealogy printouts still spread across his knees, spoke without looking up. There's a Lark Hollow funding record in the general administrative material, he said slowly. I found it weeks ago. Before any of this started, just doing routine inventory. I didn't think anything of it at the time. It's the sort of document that turns up in every institution's papers, a list of private donors who funded a wing or a piece of equipment. I only remembered it now because one of the names is Corvin. He found the folder within minutes, pulling it from a box near the reading room's east window with the particular efficient calm of a man grateful, Wren suspected, to have something concrete to do with his hands. The document was a simple ledger of institutional benefactions, dated across Lark Hollow's operational years, modest sums for the most part, a new boiler here, a set of garden benches there, the ordinary small generosities of a town's better families toward a local institution. But one entry, dated 1921, stood apart from the rest in both size and specificity, a substantial sum, recorded as funding the construction of a new private wing, for the discreet accommodation of patients requiring particular confidentiality, donated by Magistrate Ansel Corvin. 1921, Theodore said quietly. 2 years before Yvette Marin was admitted to exactly that kind of private accommodation. Wren looked at the three of them. The funding record, the cipher translation, Pete's family history spread across the table, and felt the shape of the whole thing settle into focus with the particular cold clarity that came, in her experience, only at the true turning point of any investigation, the moment when a mystery she had assumed was about one crime revealed itself to be about something larger and worse. I've been thinking about this wrong, she said slowly. I've been looking for someone who killed Yvette Marin. Deliberately. With intent. She looked down at the cipher translation again. But that's not what this describes. This describes a young woman whose silence had already been purchased, whose family had already been paid to look the other way, in an institution whose director had already accepted money to make exactly this kind of arrangement possible. Nobody needed to kill her outright. They only needed her to die in a way nobody would think to question. And they'd already spent 2 years making certain that when it happened, nobody would. Lark Hollow Sanatorium, late September, 1923. Yvette's cough began 3 days after the letter's confiscation, mild at first, easily dismissed as the ordinary complaint of a woman entering her final months of pregnancy in a building never adequately heated even in the best of seasons. Odile noted it in her journal without particular alarm, the way she noted most small physical complaints among the patients around her, part of the endless small suffering that Lark Hollow's walls seemed to generate as a matter of course. It was Ines who noticed, a week later, that the cough had not eased, and that Yvette's color had grown wrong in a way that worried her more than she said aloud. She should see the physician properly. Ines wrote, passing the note during sewing hour with an urgency that made Odile look up sharply. Not Rourke's evening visits. A proper examination, with a nurse present, notes taken as they should be. She has asked. Odile wrote back, once she had confirmed this with Yvette herself during their brief supervised time in the garden. Dr. Rourke tells her the cough is nerves, brought on by her condition, and that rest is the only remedy required. Sister Halloran examined her yesterday against his instruction, apparently, and told her privately that she did not like the sound of it. It was the first time either Odile or Ines had heard Sister Halloran described as acting against Rourke's instruction on anything, however small, and Odile found herself, reading Yvette's account of it, paying closer attention than before to the quiet, competent, watchful woman who had run Lark Hollow's wards for as long as any patient there could remember. The cough worsened through the first week of October. Yvette wrote less, her hand grown unsteady, her notes shorter and more fragmented, though what she did manage to pass along in those final days carried a clarity that struck Odile, even at the time, as the particular sharpened awareness of someone who suspected, without yet being told, that her time was more limited than anyone around her was willing to say plainly. I asked Sister Halloran directly, this morning, whether Dr. Rourke intends to call in a physician from town. She would not answer me clearly. I do not think this means she does not know the answer. I think it means the answer is one she does not wish to give me herself. You should insist. Odile wrote back, though even as she wrote it she understood, with the particular helpless clarity of 2 years' confinement, exactly how little insisting accomplished inside Lark Hollow's walls for a woman whose family had already been paid to want her quiet. The last note Yvette ever passed to Odile arrived on the evening of the 2nd of October, folded small inside a scrap of sewing thread, written in a hand that had grown so unsteady it took Odile the better part of an hour, working alone by candlelight after the ward had gone dark, to be certain she had translated it correctly. I do not think I am imagining how unwell I have become. I think Dr. Rourke knows it too, and has decided that treating me honestly would require explaining, to whoever might ask, exactly why a young woman in my condition was permitted to worsen this far without proper examination. I do not know if that is cowardice or calculation on his part. I find, tonight, that I no longer have the strength to be frightened of the difference. Whatever happens to me, I am glad, at least, that my sister knows the truth, even if the letter meant to reach her was taken before it could. If you were ever able, someday, to make certain that what I have written here outlives whatever they decide to say about how I died, I would consider that a kindness greater than any I have received in this place. Yvette Marin died in the early hours of the 3rd of October, 1923. Sister Halloran, summoned too late by a night orderly who had grown alarmed at the sound of her breathing, recorded privately, in the account she kept hidden inside her nursing bag, that the cause of death had been a sudden hemorrhage, complicated by an infection that a competent physician, called days earlier, might very plausibly have treated. Dr. Rourke's official entry, filed the following morning, recorded the cause as consumption. A diagnosis, Sister Halloran noted with a bitterness she rarely allowed herself even in private, that required no explanation for why no outside physician had ever been called, and no accounting for why a wealthy family's payments toward a discreet young woman's care had continued, without interruption, straight through to the week of her death. Verholt, present day. Wren confronted Adeline Corvin the following afternoon, armed with the funding record, the cipher translation, and the cut ledger page, laid out with careful precision across the walnut desk in Adeline's office. Adeline studied each document in turn, unhurried, her composure unbroken even as Wren watched, closely, for any small crack in it. My great-grandfather funded a great many things in this town, she said finally. A private wing at Lark Hollow is hardly evidence of anything beyond ordinary civic generosity. 2 years before a young woman with an inconvenient pregnancy was admitted into exactly that wing, and died there under circumstances that nobody at the time thought worth investigating, and that somebody, quite recently, has taken considerable trouble to make certain nobody investigates now. That is a very serious accusation to make on the strength of a coded diary and a torn page you cannot prove was cut by anyone living. I'm not accusing you of anything, Mrs. Corvin. I'm asking you what you know. For the first time since Wren had met her, something in Adeline Corvin's carefully composed face genuinely faltered. Not collapse, not confession, but a small, human flicker of uncertainty, there and gone so quickly that Wren might have doubted she'd seen it at all, had she not spent a career learning to watch faces for exactly that kind of unguarded instant. I know that my family has spent 4 generations being spoken of in this town as its great benefactors, Adeline said finally, quietly. I know that I have built a great deal of my own life on the comfortable assumption that this reputation was earned rather than purchased. I am not certain, Miss Ashcombe, that I wish to know anything further than that, not because I doubt what you've found, but because I am not sure, at 61 years old, that I have the stomach to discover my whole life has rested on something rotten. She looked up, and her voice, when she continued, had lost its earlier polish entirely. I would ask you to consider, before you go any further with this, exactly what you intend to do with what you find, and who in this town will be left standing in the wreckage of it besides yourself. It was not, Wren thought, leaving the office a few minutes later, quite a confession. But it was not a denial either, and in the careful, exhausted honesty of it, she understood that Adeline Corvin knew, or at the very least deeply suspected, exactly what Wren was circling toward. She returned to the archive that evening, later than usual, to collect a box of photocopies she'd left in the reading room, and found, the moment she stepped through the door into the west corridor, that something was wrong before she could have said precisely what. The gap in the wall, The one she had so carefully concealed behind the stack of parish boxes after her first discovery, stood open. The boxes had been moved, not carelessly but deliberately, stacked to one side with a neatness that suggested whoever had done it had taken their time and had no particular fear of being caught doing so. Beyond it, in the narrow black passage leading to the forgotten records room, a thin beam of torchlight swept once across the far wall and vanished, and Wren, standing frozen in the corridor with her heart suddenly loud in her own ears, understood that whoever had sent the note under her door 4 days before had decided, at last, that warnings alone were no longer sufficient. Chapter 7. The South Corridor. Wren did not remember deciding to move. She remembered only that one moment she was standing frozen in the west corridor watching a beam of torchlight sweep across a wall she had thought only she and Theodore knew existed, and the next she was already backing away, phone in hand, thumb finding Theodore's number by muscle memory rather than thought. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Wren? Someone's in the building." She kept her voice low, barely above a breath, pressed against the cold stone of the corridor wall well back from the gap. "In the east wing. The records room. I can see torchlight. Get out. Now." "I'll call Savik, I'll meet you outside, Wren, do not go in there." She had no intention of going in there. She had every intention, in fact, of retreating exactly the way she had come, quietly and quickly, back through the reading room and out the archive's heavy front door into the wet, gaslit safety of the street, until, easing backward past the last of the parish record boxes, her elbow caught the edge of a shelf, and a stack of folders slid to the floor with a clatter that seemed, in the building's vast listening silence, loud as a gunshot. The torchlight beyond the gap went dark instantly. For 3 full seconds, Wren stood absolutely still, listening to nothing but her own heartbeat and the small, distant tick of rain against a high window somewhere above her. Then she heard it, footsteps, quick and light, moving away from her down the black stone passage rather than toward it, and a moment later the unmistakable, hollow sound of a door somewhere at the far end of the sealed wing, a door she had not known existed, opening and closing in the dark. By the time Theodore arrived, breathless, still buttoning his coat, and Pete not far behind him, pale and clearly having dressed in the dark himself, whoever had been in the records room was long gone. Savik arrived 20 minutes later, torch and gloves in hand, and worked the gap and the passage beyond it with the unhurried, methodical thoroughness of a woman who had clearly not lost the habits of her old profession simply because she'd retired from it. "No forced entry at the main doors," she reported eventually, straightening from her examination of the small side door at the passage's far end, a door Wren had genuinely never noticed, half concealed behind a fall of ivy that had grown through a crack in the exterior wall. "This door's old, but the lock's been oiled recently. Someone's used it more than once, and taken care that it kept working quietly when they did." "Someone who knew the building's layout better than I do," Wren said. "Better than Pete does, even. Or someone who's been getting into this part of the archive for rather longer than any of us have known to look for it." Savik examined the cabinet itself, its door still standing open, the journals, Wren counted them with a fresh, cold anxiety, and found, with some relief, that all 30 remaining volumes appeared to still be present, undisturbed inside. "Nothing's missing, as far as you can tell?" "Nothing I can see." But they knew exactly where to look. They went straight to this room, not the general storage, someone who already knew what was in here, or at least that something was. Savik was quiet for a moment, considering this. That changes things, she said finally. A warning note is one kind of pressure. Breaking into a sealed building at night is another entirely. Whoever's protecting this secret is more frightened now than they were a week ago, which tells me you're closer to something than even you may realize. She looked at the three of them in turn, Ren, Theodore, and Pete, standing close together in the cold, dust-thick passage. I'd move these journals somewhere safer than a condemned records room, starting tonight. And I'd stop treating this as history. Whoever came through that door tonight is not dead and buried. They're very much alive, and very much still deciding what they're willing to do to keep this buried with them. They moved the journals that same night, wrapped carefully in the acid-free tissue Ren had brought for exactly this purpose, carried in 3 separate bags between the 3 of them through Verholt's rain-slicked streets to the locked back room of Theodore's print shop, which had, he pointed out with a tired attempt at humor, the advantage of nobody in this town having any earthly reason to think there's anything interesting hidden in a bookbinder's storeroom. It was well past 1 in the morning by the time they'd finished, the journals arranged carefully on a shelf behind stacks of blank ledger paper and binding cloth, and none of the 3 of them showed any particular inclination to go home. I keep thinking about what Savik said, Pete said eventually, sitting on an upturned crate with his coffee gone cold in his hands. About whoever came through that door being frightened, not just careful. I've spent 2 years being careful around Adeline Corvin without ever really letting myself wonder why it felt necessary. If she's frightened enough now to have someone break in. We don't know it was her, Ren said. Or anyone acting for her. It could as easily be someone else entirely, someone connected to the family, or the institution, that none of us has considered yet. Maybe. Pete turned his cup slowly, the same habitual gesture Ren had noticed in Theodore, and found herself wondering, absently, whether it was simply a Verholt trait, born of too many quiet evenings in cafes with too much left unsaid. There's something I haven't told either of you, he said finally. I've been putting it off since this afternoon, and I think tonight's made it feel considerably more urgent than I wanted it to be. Ren set down her own cup. Pete. My grandmother. The one whose family connects back to Halloran, she died 4 years ago. My mother inherited most of her things, but there was a small box that came to me specifically, because I was the one who'd shown any interest in the family history at all. Old photographs, mostly. A christening gown. A few letters. He paused. And one sealed envelope, addressed in a hand my mother didn't recognize, marked only with a single word, Halloran. My grandmother left instructions with it. A note of her own, saying it wasn't to be opened unless the family ever had good reason to understand what had happened to Bridget Halloran at Lark Hollow. Otherwise, she said, it should stay sealed, out of respect for whatever Bridget had wanted kept private. The room had gone very still. You've had it this whole time, Theodore said quietly. I'd genuinely forgotten it existed until tonight, if I'm honest. It's been in a drawer in my flat for 4 years. I didn't think about it once, this whole time you've been asking questions, until I was standing in that dark passage tonight watching someone else's torchlight and thinking about exactly how much my own family might already know that I've simply never bothered to look at. Pete looked up at both of them, and his voice, when he continued, had steadied into something Wren hadn't heard from him before, a quiet, deliberate resolve. "I think tonight counts as good reason." "I think it's counted as good reason for a while now, and I only wanted an excuse strong enough to stop feeling guilty about opening something Bridget Halloran never meant for a stranger to read." "It's still your decision," Wren said carefully. "Not ours." "I know." Pete stood, setting down his cold coffee. "I'm going to go get it. Tonight. I don't think I'll sleep otherwise, and I don't much fancy being alone with it once I have." Lark Hollow Sanatorium, October 1923 to 1930. Sister Bridget Halloran did not sleep the night Yvette Marin died, though not for any reason Dr. Rourke would ever have permitted himself to understand. She wrote her private account of that night within hours of it happening, while the details remained sharp enough to trust, hiding the pages inside the lining of her nursing bag before the ward woke properly to the day's routine. She recorded the hemorrhage, the delay, the absence of any outside physician despite 3 separate requests she herself had made to Dr. Rourke over the preceding week, each one met with the same gentle, immovable insistence that rest was the only remedy required. She recorded, too, without editorializing, the fact that the family's payments toward Yvette's discreet accommodation had continued without interruption straight through the week of her death, a detail she suspected, correctly, would matter more to anyone who might one day investigate than any amount of medical description she could offer. She did not confront Dr. Rourke. She understood, with the particular clear-eyed pragmatism of a woman who had spent 11 years learning exactly how much power she did and did not hold inside Lark Hollow's walls, that confrontation would accomplish nothing beyond her own dismissal, and the swift, thorough destruction of whatever record she might otherwise manage to preserve. Instead, she waited, and watched, and quietly began collecting fragments of Yvette's confiscated correspondence that had never quite made it to the destruction Rourke believed complete, notes passed to her, cautiously, by patients who had come to trust her carefully maintained discretion, and eventually, in the last years before Lark Hollow's closure, the ciphered journals themselves, handed to her one by women who understood, better than anyone, exactly what it meant to have their testimony believed by no one who mattered. She built the hiding place herself, in the winter of 1929, in the small forgotten records room off the south corridor that had, by then, been unused for so long that nobody troubled to check it more than once a year. The iron cabinet had come from a decommissioned ward, unremarkable enough that its presence in a disused room raised no questions from anyone who happened to glance in. She fitted the padlock herself, with tools borrowed quietly from the building's maintenance stores, and told no one, not even Odile Ferrand, whose journal formed the largest single collection inside it, the full extent of what she intended. She was dismissed from Lark Hollow in March of 1930, officially for insubordination, a charge Dr. Rourke never specified further, and which Sister Halloran, in her own private account, described only as a disagreement regarding a matter I do not intend to record here, for the sake of those who might still be harmed by it. She left the cabinet exactly where it stood, trusting, correctly, though she would never live to see it confirmed, that the building's slow decline into disuse would protect it more effectively than any hiding place she could have devised herself. Her final entry, written the night before her dismissal took effect, closed with a single line that Wren would not translate from Odile's accompanying testimony until weeks later, but which Sister Halloran had written, plainly and without cipher, in her own private account, in a hand that had grown, by then, both tired and entirely certain. I do not know who will find this, or when, or whether it will matter to them the way it has mattered to me. I know only that I could not save her, and that this is the only thing left within my power to do instead. Someone, someday, should know what this place cost the women it claimed to be helping. If that someone is reading this now, I am glad, whoever you are, that you did not decide it wasn't worth the trouble of looking. Verholt, present day. Pete returned just before 3 in the morning, rain-soaked and pale, a small, yellowed envelope held carefully in both hands as though it might disintegrate at the wrong angle of pressure. He set it down on the workbench between the three of them, beneath the print shop's single working lamp, and for a long moment none of them moved to touch it. My grandmother kept this for 60 years without opening it, Pete said quietly. I've had it in a drawer for 4 more, doing the exact same thing. He looked up at Wren, and then at Theodore, and something in his expression made clear that whatever decision he had made walking home through the rain, he had made it fully, and did not intend to unmake it now. I don't think I want to be the only one who reads it first. Wren looked at the envelope. Bridget Halloran's careful, decades-old hand across its front, sealed with wax gone brittle and cracked with age, addressed to no one in particular, meant, she understood now, for exactly this moment, a stranger and 2 descendants of a small town's oldest secret, standing together in the middle of the night, finally ready to hear what a dismissed nurse had wanted someone to know. Open it, she said. Chapter 8. The Nurse's Letter. The wax gave way easily, brittle enough after 90 years that it crumbled rather than cracked, and Pete's hands were visibly unsteady as he unfolded the single sheet inside, smaller than Wren had expected, the paper gone soft and thin at its creases, covered on both sides in a hand far plainer and more hurried than the careful cipher she had spent weeks learning to read. He read it once to himself first, his lips moving slightly, his face going through several small changes Wren couldn't quite name before he looked up, cleared his throat, and began again, aloud, for all 3 of them. To whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, asterisk. My name is Bridget Halloran. I was head nurse at Lark Hollow Sanatorium from 1912 until my dismissal in March of 1930. I write this because I do not trust that the truth of what happened there will survive in any form the institution itself was willing to keep, and because I have grown too old and too tired to go on carrying it alone in silence, even if I lack the courage, or perhaps simply the standing, to speak it aloud while I am still able to be believed. Asterisk. A young woman named Yvette Marin was admitted to Lark Hollow in April of 1923, under circumstances that had nothing whatsoever to do with any illness of the mind, and everything to do with a pregnancy her family found more convenient to hide than to acknowledge. The child's father was a man of standing in Verholt, whose name I will set down here plainly, since I no longer see any virtue in the discretion that cost Yvette her life. His name was Edric Van Toor, at that time a junior magistrate under the patronage of Ansel Corvin, who had himself funded the private wing in which Yvette was housed, 2 years before her arrival, for the express purpose of accommodating exactly this kind of arrangement. Asterisk. Pete's voice caught slightly on the name. Theodore leaned forward, and Wren felt her own pulse quicken, a name, at last, where for weeks there had only been careful silences and the pronoun he. Dr. Haviland Rourke was aware of the arrangement from its beginning, and accepted, I believe, both money and the ongoing patronage of Magistrate Corvin's office in exchange for his discretion. When Yvette fell ill in the final month of her confinement, I requested on 3 separate occasions that an outside physician be called. Dr. Rourke refused each time, insisting that rest alone was sufficient, though I do not believe, even now, that he genuinely thought this to be true. I believe he understood that an honest examination would require an honest explanation of her condition to anyone outside the institution who might ask, and that such an explanation would end the arrangement that had, by then, sustained his position for 2 years. Yvette Marin died in the early hours of the 3rd of October, 1923, of a hemorrhage that I believe, to this day, could very plausibly have been treated had it been addressed even a few days sooner. Dr. Rourke recorded the cause of death as consumption. No coroner was called. No family member came to claim her body beyond the arrangement of a private, unmarked burial, paid for, I later learned, from the same account that had funded her discreet accommodation from the start. I was dismissed from my position 7 years later, in 1930, after Dr. Rourke discovered that I had continued, in the intervening years, to quietly preserve testimony from patients regarding this and other matters the institution preferred forgotten. He called it insubordination. I have never once, in the years since, regretted whatever it cost me. I do not know what became of Edric Van Tour, whose name I have chosen, at last, to set down honestly, nor whether the Corvin family's patronage of him continued beyond Lark Hollow's closing. I know only that a young woman died because too many people found her silence more convenient than her survival, and that I could not save her, though I have spent every year since trying, in whatever small way remained within my power, to make certain her death was not permitted to simply disappear along with her. If you are reading this, I hope it means that someone, at last, thought her worth the trouble of remembering. B. Helleran, October 1930 *. Nobody spoke for a long moment after Pete finished reading. The print shop's single lamp buzzed faintly, the only sound beyond the rain still ticking against the shuttered window. Van Tour, Theodore said finally, quietly. Edric Van Tour. Do you know the name? Wren asked. Not personally. But there's a Van Tour family plot in the old churchyard, one of the oldest in Verholt. I'd have to check, but I don't think it's a name that disappeared from this town after 1923. I think it's a name that's still around, in one form or another, the way most old town names are. He looked up. It'll be findable. Records, descendants. If Corvin funded his position, there'll be some trace of the connection somewhere in the town's civic history, if anyone's ever thought to go looking for it. Somebody has, Pete said slowly. That's the part that scares me. Whoever cut that register page, whoever came through the south door last night, they already know this name. They've probably known it for years. We're only just catching up to a secret this town's been actively managing for a very long time. Wren spent the following 2 days doing exactly what Theodore had suggested, tracing Edric Van Tour through whatever civic and church records the town's collection still held, cross-referencing dates, offices held, and, eventually, in a slim volume of the district's judicial appointments, finding confirmation of what Halloran's letter had already told her. Edric Van Tour, appointed junior magistrate in 1920 under the patronage of Ansel Corvin, elevated to a more senior post in 1924, the year after Yvette Marin's death, and serving with quiet, unremarkable distinction until his retirement in 1951. There was no mention, anywhere in the official record, of any child, any scandal, any connection whatsoever to Lark Hollow Sanatorium. The silence, Wren thought, studying the clean, respectable arc of the man's career, was its own kind of evidence. The particular, telling absence of a life that had been very carefully protected from ever intersecting, on paper, with the one it had quietly ruined. She was compiling the last of this research, late on the second evening, when her phone rang, a call this time, not a message, and from a number she recognized as Adeline Corvin's. "I understand you've been looking into an old magistrate's appointment records," Adeline said, without preamble, her voice tighter than Wren had yet heard it. "Edric Van Tour." "Yes." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Wren wondered if the call had dropped. "I'd like to speak with you," Adeline said finally. "Not in my office. Somewhere private. Tonight, if you're willing." They met at a small cafe near the canal, long closed for the evening, its owner apparently willing to leave a back table free for Adeline Corvin without being asked twice. Adeline arrived without the composed authority she'd worn in every previous meeting, dressed more plainly than Wren had yet seen her, and sat down heavily, as though the short walk from her car had cost her more than it should have. "My father requested access to the 1923 ledger 11 years ago," she said, without preamble. "I know, because I found the request myself, going through his papers after he died. I never understood, at the time, why he'd wanted it. I told myself it was simple curiosity about the family's history in the town, and I let myself believe that, because the alternative required asking questions I did not, if I am honest, particularly want answered." She looked up at Wren, and her eyes, in the cafe's dim after-hours light, looked considerably older than they had a week before. "I read the ledger myself, eventually, after he died. I found the entry for Yvette Marin. I did not, at the time, connect it to anything beyond an old, sad story from a defunct institution. I did not know the name Van Tour at all until you began asking about it 2 days ago. Do you know it now?" Adeline was quiet for a long moment. "My father's closest friend, growing up, was a man named Corentin Van Tour," she said finally. "Edric's grandson. They served on committees together for 30 years. The Historical Society, the Church Restoration Fund, eventually this very Archives Board. It was Corentin who first suggested, 20 years ago, that the East Wing be sealed permanently rather than repaired, for reasons he described, at the time, as purely financial." She exhaled slowly. "I do not know for certain that my father and his oldest friend spent decades quietly protecting a secret that belonged to both their families equally. But I no longer believe, Miss Ashcombe, that I can afford to keep assuming they didn't. What do you want from me?" "I want to know what you intend to do with what you've found." Adeline's voice, when she said it, had none of its earlier evasiveness. "Because the sale of this building closes in 11 days, and once it does, whatever remains of the East Wing structure, cabinet, records, whatever else you haven't yet found, becomes the legal property of a development company with no interest whatsoever in preserving any of it. If you intend to make this public, Miss Ashcombe, you have considerably less time than you may think." Wren felt something cold settle low in her stomach. 11 days. I thought the timeline was 6 weeks. It was, until this afternoon. The buyer's lawyers pushed to accelerate closing, citing delays they attribute to your cataloging work running longer than expected. Adeline held her gaze, and for the first time since they'd met, Wren saw, unmistakably, something that looked almost like an apology. I did not request the acceleration, if that reassures you at all. I no longer entirely know who did, or why, though I have begun to have suspicions I would rather not say aloud in a cafe at this hour. She stood, gathering her coat around her with something less than her usual composure. I would use whatever time remains carefully, Miss Ashcombe. I do not think either of us has any left to waste. Chapter 9. The Last Night. 11 days, Wren had thought, walking home from the cafe with Adeline Corvin's warning still ringing in her ears, was either far too little time or exactly enough, depending entirely on how much of the story still remained to be found. She would not know which until she had translated the last of Odile Farrant's journal, the entries she had been deliberately saving, without quite admitting it to herself, for whatever came nearest the end. She worked through the following 2 nights almost without sleeping, Theodore and Pete trading off shifts beside her at the small desk in the print shop's back room, the 3 of them surrounded now by neat stacks of translated pages, cross-referenced against Halloran's letter and the funding records and the cut register page, building, entry by entry, a case that Wren had begun, cautiously, to believe might actually hold. The final pages of Odile's journal, written in the last months before Lark Hollow's closure in 1930, were different from everything that had come before them, steadier, somehow, despite everything, as though the act of finishing what she'd started had settled something in her that 7 years of confinement had not. October 1929. It has been 6 years since Y died, and I find that grief does not diminish so much as it changes shape. I no longer wake in the night certain I have heard her voice in the corridor. I have instead begun to think of her the way one thinks of a debt not yet paid, patiently, steadily, with the quiet certainty that the account remains open, whatever else has changed around it. Sister H came to me this evening, which she has not done in some months, and told me, carefully, that she believes her own position here will not survive much longer. She would not say why, though I have my suspicions, given how closely Dr. Rourke has watched her comings and goings this past year. I asked her, plainly, what would become of everything she has kept, the letters, the notes, whatever record she has built alongside our own. She told me only that she had made arrangements, and that I was not to worry myself further with the particulars, for my own protection as much as hers. I do not know if I will live to see whatever she intends come to anything. I am 41 this year, and Lark Hollow has a way of making a woman older than her years suggest. I find, tonight, that I am not writing this final entry in fear, but in something closer to hope, the strange, stubborn hope of a woman who has spent 7 years believing that the truth, once written down carefully enough, cannot be entirely killed, even by people with every resource required to try. If anyone ever reads this, and I confess I no longer know whether to hope that they do, or to hope, more selfishly, that the world simply outgrows the need for women like us to have written it at all, know this: Yvette Marin did not die of the lungs. She died because her silence was worth more, to the people who arranged it, than her life. I have spent 7 years making certain that at least one true account of that fact would survive them. I do not know if it was enough. I only know it was everything I had left to give asterisk. Oh, Farrand asterisk. Wren sat for a long time with the final page after finishing the translation, aware of Theodore's hand, quiet and steady, resting briefly on her shoulder, and Pete, across the room, wiping his eyes with the unself-conscious openness of a man who had stopped, somewhere in the last week, pretending this story belonged to someone else's family rather than his own. "There's one more thing," Wren said finally, her voice rougher than she intended. "The confiscated letter. Yvette's letter to her sister. Odile references it here, and in an earlier entry, as though she knew, or at least strongly suspected, who intercepted it. She found the passage within minutes, an entry from several years earlier that she had translated in an early pass without fully registering its significance. Y told me once, near the end, that she believed Dr. Rourke had read her letter himself, alone, before deciding its fate. She said his manner toward her changed within days of its disappearance, not merely watchful, as before, but focused, in a way that frightened her more than his earlier gentleness had. I have thought of this often since. I believe it was not staff discretion that took that letter from her. I believe it was Rourke's own hand, and that whatever he read in it convinced him, finally, that her silence could no longer be trusted to hold on its own asterisk. That's the missing piece, Theodore said quietly. Not just negligence. A deliberate decision, made by Rourke himself, once he understood the letter threatened to expose the whole arrangement. It still doesn't prove murder, Pete said. Doesn't prove intent to kill her, specifically. No, Wren agreed. But it proves he knew, with certainty, exactly what he was risking by continuing to withhold treatment. It proves this wasn't an oversight that happened to prove fatal. It was a calculated risk he took, with a young woman's life, to protect an arrangement that was paying him. It was past midnight, the three of them finally beginning to pack away the last of the night's work, when Pete's phone buzzed on the desk beside him. He glanced at it, frowned, and then went very still in a way that made both Wren and Theodore look up. "It's from an unknown number," he said slowly, "sent to my personal phone, not the archive line." He read it aloud, his voice tight. Asterisk, you should have stopped when you had the chance. Some of us have been protecting this town longer than you've been alive asterisk. Wren felt something cold settle over the room. That's not the same phrasing as my messages, she said slowly. Mine were about doors best left shut. This is different. Personal. Pete was quiet for a long moment, staring at his phone with an expression Wren couldn't quite read, not fear, exactly, but something heavier, more complicated. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. I need to tell you both something, he said. And I need you to let me finish before either of you says anything. Theodore set down the folder he'd been holding. Wren said nothing, waiting. The message you got, Wren. The first one, under your door. And the text before that. Pete would not quite meet her eyes. I sent them. The silence that followed felt, to Wren, like the whole print shop had briefly stopped breathing. I didn't send tonight's, Pete continued quickly, before either of them could speak. I swear to you, whatever's just come through, it isn't mine. But the first two, I sent those. I'm the one who put that note under your door. Why, Ren said, very quietly, would you do that? Because I was frightened, and because I genuinely believed, at the time, that frightening you enough to slow down was safer than whatever might happen if you moved too fast, before I'd had a chance to understand what I was actually protecting or who I was actually protecting it from. He finally looked up, and his eyes were bright with something between shame and desperate honesty. I found the photocopy log the same week you found the cabinet. I saw my great-great-grandmother's name buried in a family tree I'd never properly looked at, and I panicked. I didn't know yet whether my own family had been complicit in whatever Lark Hollow had done, or whether they'd been the ones trying to stop it. I wanted time to find out before you brought the whole thing crashing down around people who might not deserve it, including, possibly, me. So I sent you a warning I never intended to follow through on, hoping it would buy me a few days to look into my own family quietly, without anyone watching. And when it didn't work, I stopped. I never sent anything after that first note. I swear it. His voice cracked slightly. I know how that sounds, given everything since. I know I should have told you the moment I realized what my family actually was in this story, protectors, not perpetrators. I told myself I would, once I understood enough to explain it properly. And then tonight happened, and I realized I'd been about to let you believe, for I don't know how much longer, that some stranger out there was the only person who'd ever tried to warn you off, when really it had been me, sitting right beside you, the whole time. Ren studied his face for a long moment. The exhaustion, the guilt, the particular rawness of a man who had clearly been carrying this alone for longer than was good for him. She thought of the 4 generations of careful Verholt silence Theodore had described, the inherited instinct to leave certain doors shut rather than risk what lay behind them. She thought, too, of her own instinct, on the very first night, to say nothing to anyone about the cabinet until she'd had time to understand it herself. I'm not going to pretend that didn't scare me, she said finally. But I understand it. I think, if I'm honest, I might have done something similar, in your position. She held his gaze. But whoever sent tonight's message, that's not you. Which means someone else out there has decided the stakes are worth threatening you directly, by name, on a number that isn't public. Which means, Theodore said slowly, that whoever's really protecting this secret already knows exactly who Pete is, and exactly what he means to us. They sat with that for a long moment, the print shop silent except for the rain, before Pete's phone buzzed again, a second message, from a different number this time, and this one, when he read it aloud, was not a threat at all. I'll be there tomorrow. Bring everything asterisk. It was signed, simply, A. Corvin. Chapter 10. What the Archive Remembers. The town council chamber had not, as far as Ren could tell, been used for anything more contentious than road maintenance disputes in a very long time, and it showed in the careful, half-hearted way the room had been arranged for the morning session. A scattering of folding chairs, a long table at the front for the committee, and, along one wall, a row of tall windows through which the morning's rain fell steady and gray against Verholt's rooftops, the same rain, Ren thought, that had followed her through every significant turn of the last 6 weeks. She arrived early with Theodore and Pete, 3 boxes of carefully organized evidence between them. The journals, photographed and catalogued now with the proper rigor her training had always insisted on, Halloran's letter, sealed in its protective sleeve, the funding record, the cut register page, the photocopy log, and a clean, typed summary Wren had spent the previous night writing, tying each thread to every other with the plain, unadorned clarity of a historian who had, for once, no need to argue for the significance of what she'd found, because the documents argued for themselves. The chamber filled slowly as the hour approached. Council members, a scattering of townspeople drawn by whatever version of the rumor had circulated in the days since the sales acceleration became known, and, arriving with the same quiet, unhurried authority Wren remembered from their first meeting 6 weeks before, Adeline Corvin, dressed today not in the composed elegance of the archive director's office but in something plainer, darker, the clothing, Wren thought, of a woman attending something closer to a funeral than a committee hearing. Adeline did not sit with the committee. She crossed instead to where Wren stood with Theodore and Pete, and said, quietly, "I've asked to speak before the vote is taken. I would ask that you let me go first." "You don't have to do this," Wren said. "I know." Adeline's composure, when she looked up, held something Wren had not seen in her before. Not the careful reasonableness of their earlier meetings, but something plainer and more exhausted, the look of a woman who had finally stopped calculating the cost of a decision and simply made it. "I find, Miss Ashcombe, that I would rather be the one who finally says it than the one who is, once again, asked to deny it." The chamber quieted as the council chair called the session to order, moving with brisk efficiency through the morning's stated business. Final approval of the archive sale, a formality, the chair noted, given the buyer's accelerated timeline and the committee's prior recommendation. It was only when Adeline rose, requesting the floor before the vote, that the room's easy inattention sharpened into something more watchful. "I have chaired this committee for 6 years," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the high-ceilinged room. "In that time I have advocated consistently for the sale of the Verholt Municipal Archive, on the grounds that the town no longer has the resources to maintain a building that has stood partially condemned for over 4 decades. She paused. "I want to tell you this morning why that advocacy was never entirely honest, and why I no longer believe I can, in good conscience, allow this vote to proceed without first telling you what our historian found in that condemned wing." What followed took the better part of 40 minutes. Adeline speaking plainly, without the practiced smoothness of their earlier conversations, laying out the history of Lark Hollow Sanatorium, her own family's role in funding its private wing, the death of Yvette Marin, and the decades of careful, inherited silence that had followed it, culminating, quietly and without excuse, in her own father's decision, 11 years earlier, to ensure that the one surviving ledger capable of confirming the story was reported destroyed rather than simply hidden. "I do not know," she said, near the end, "whether my father acted to protect the Corvin name specifically, or the Vantor family alongside it, whose friendship with him spanned decades and whose grandfather's role in this story I have only understood in the last week. I do not think, at this point, that the distinction matters a great deal. What matters is that a young woman died in this town, 93 years ago, because too many people with power found her silence more convenient than her survival, and that people bearing my own name spent the better part of a century making certain her death stayed exactly as convenient as they had first arranged it to be." She turned, then, to Wren, and gestured for her to come forward. Wren spent the next half hour presenting what she had. The ciphered journals, translated and cross-referenced, Halloran's letter, read aloud in full, its plain, unflinching final lines landing in the chamber's hush with a weight Wren felt in her own chest even now, having read them a dozen times already. The funding record connecting Ansel Corvin's patronage to Lark Hollow's private wing, the photocopy log proving Weald Corvin's access to a ledger his daughter had been told, and had repeated in good faith, was destroyed. And finally, the freshly cut register page, evidence, she said plainly, that someone in Verholt had been actively protecting this secret as recently as 6 weeks before. Every document here corroborates every other document, she said, near the end. Not because I have arranged them cleverly, but because they were never meant to be read alone. 30 women, writing independently, in a private code none of them could have coordinated even if they'd wanted to, describing the same death, the same silence, the same institution's careful discretion. A nurse who risked her position to preserve their testimony rather than destroy it, as she was ordered to. A family's own internal records confirming, without meaning to, exactly the arrangement those women described. She looked out at the room, at faces she did not know, whose grandparents and great-grandparents had lived through the very silence she was now asking them to finally break. I did not come to Verholt looking for a scandal. I came looking for a job I badly needed, in a building nobody particularly wanted preserved. I am asking you now, not as an outsider, but as someone who has spent 6 weeks coming to care a great deal about a woman who has been dead for nearly a century, to let her name mean something, at last, in the place that took such careful trouble to make certain it never would. The vote to halt the sale passed with a margin that surprised even Wren, though she would learn afterward that the deciding factor, more than any document she'd presented, had been Adeline Corvin's own willingness to stand and confirm it publicly, a woman whose family name had shaped the town's assumptions about respectability for 4 generations, choosing, finally, to spend that same respectability on telling the truth rather than protecting it. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of activity entirely unlike the quiet, solitary cataloging Wren had originally been hired to perform. The East Wing was formally reopened, its structural concerns addressed at last with funding the council found, somewhat pointedly, considerably faster once the alternative was public embarrassment. The journals were properly conserved, digitized, and, at Wren's insistence, and with Pete's enthusiastic support, prepared for a permanent public reading room, dedicated not to Lark Hollow's directors or benefactors, but to the women whose voices the institution had spent a century trying to erase. Yvette Marin's name was entered, at last, into the town's death register, in a formal ceremony attended by a small crowd that included, to everyone's quiet surprise, several elderly descendants of the Van Tor family, who had apparently known fragments of the story for years without ever quite understanding their shape, and who wept, openly and without embarrassment, when Wren read Halloran's letter aloud a second time, for an audience finally large enough to matter. Adeline Corvin did not attend the ceremony, though she sent, in her place, a simple wreath and a note that Wren kept, folded, inside the back cover of her own research notebook, **, I cannot undo what my family did. I can only be grateful, at the end of it, that someone finally made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise, **. It was Pete, 3 weeks later, going through the last uncatalogued boxes from the East Wing's original collapse debris, who found it. A 30-second journal, separate from the others, wrapped in oilcloth rather than tissue, tucked inside a gap behind a section of wall that had clearly been sealed at a different time than the records room itself, using different materials, in a hand Wren did not immediately recognize from any of the cipher samples she had spent the last 6 weeks learning to read. "It's not Odil's hand," she said slowly, turning the fragile pages beneath the reading room's restored lighting, Theodore and Pete both leaning in beside her. "It's not any hand I've matched to the other journals." "Another patient," Theodore said. "One nobody's identified yet." "Or," Wren said slowly, feeling the particular cold clarity that had marked every real turning point of the last 6 weeks, "someone from a different institution entirely. The binding's the same as the others." "The oilcloth wrapping isn't, that's a different preservation method, done by someone who understood exactly what they were protecting, but who wasn't Sister Halloran." She looked up at Theodore and Pete, and found, in both their faces, the same quiet, weary recognition she felt herself, the particular exhaustion of people who had believed, for 3 glorious weeks, that a very old, very carefully guarded story had finally been told in full. "You think this is a different case," Pete said. "Not Lark Hollow." "I think," Wren said, opening the fragile cover carefully, finding, on its first page, a single line of cipher she did not yet have the key to translate, "that Verholt may have been keeping more than one secret behind its locked doors. And I think, given everything we've learned about how carefully this town protects the things it would rather forget, we are very likely not finished asking questions yet." Outside, the rain had finally stopped, the first clear evening Verholt had seen in weeks, gold light spilling low and warm across the wet cobblestones and the tall windows of the reading room where Yvette Marin's name now hung, quietly, on a small brass plaque beside the door. A woman, finally, remembered exactly as she had asked to be, by someone who had thought her worth the trouble of looking. The end.